She stared at the for sale sign, and whispered, "Everything I have is here." In that moment, I realized some hearts never let go, even when change is knocking. The late afternoon sun spilled across the quiet suburban street, brushing the worn pavement with gold, and yet somehow, nothing around the small house seemed ordinary. I had come to check on a property, nothing more, but when I turned the corner, my attention was drawn immediately to her. She stood in front of the "For Sale" sign, her posture still yet deliberate, like a figure carefully etched into the scenery rather than part of it. There was a gravity in the way she carried herself, a quiet insistence that this moment, this place, mattered more than anything else around her. She wasn't moving at first. Just standing, shoulders relaxed, one hand brushing the edge of the sign almost absent-mindedly. Her scarf caught the breeze, fluttering slightly, and I noticed how her hair, touched by sunlight, glinted with a softness that made her appear almost untouchable, beautiful, yet distant. There was a patience in her gaze, the kind that had weathered years of choices, memories, and perhaps a little solitude. I felt, instinctively, that she was studying the house the way one studies a chapter of their own life, trying to memorize every corner, every shadow, every familiar mark. I slowed my pace as I approached, my shoes crunching softly on the dry leaves scattered along the walkway. She didn't seem to notice me at first. Her eyes traced the edges of the porch, lingered on the steps, and drifted to the garden where the late blooms of autumn struggled to stay bright against the softening chill. There was a quiet reverence in her movements, as if each glance was a small act of remembrance, of holding on to something precious. Even from a distance, I could see the subtle tension in her hands. One curled lightly around the edge of the sign, while the other rested against her hip, fingers brushing the fabric of her coat. It was a gesture that spoke of hesitancy, perhaps a fear of letting go, yet also of resolve, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever she was attached to, she needed to face it before she could move on. I found myself studying her as much as the house itself. The way she tilted her head ever so slightly, the way her lips parted for just a fraction of a second, as if she were murmuring memories to herself. There was a mix of serenity and sadness about her, a balance I couldn't quite name but immediately recognized as something profoundly human. I felt drawn to her, though I had no reason to be. Her presence seemed to pull at a part of me I didn't know was waiting. For a moment, the world felt hushed. The wind softened, the distant hum of traffic faded, and all I could focus on was her, the delicate set of her shoulders, the thoughtful bend of her neck, the way her gaze seemed to hold the house in a private conversation I wasn't invited to join. And yet, I couldn't look away. My curiosity wasn't just about the property anymore, it was about her, about what she felt standing there in that golden light, alone yet commanding attention without uttering a single word. It was a quiet, ordinary street, with a for sale sign that should have meant nothing to anyone else, and yet she made it feel sacred. Something about her presence, the weight of memories she carried in silence, made me understand immediately, this wasn't just a house to her. This was home, history, heart, and the threshold of change, all at once. And in that brief encounter, before a word had been spoken, I felt the first, undeniable pull of curiosity and something more, something heavier, an unspoken connection that demanded I stay, even if just for a moment, to witness what she might do next. She didn't notice me at first, or perhaps she did and simply didn't acknowledge it. Either way, I found myself lingering, careful not to break the delicate moment she seemed to be having with the house. There was something in the way she moved, soft, precise, unhurried, that made the air feel heavier, more charged, though the street was empty and silent. I could see her fingers brushing along the wooden railing of the porch, tracing patterns almost as if she were reading invisible lines of a story only she knew. The sunlight had shifted, painting the walls in soft, warm hues, and it caught her eyes in a way that made them seem reflective, almost glass-like. They weren't searching for me, not yet, but they held a depth that hinted at years of careful observation, quiet judgments, and moments she had chosen to keep close to her chest. I felt like an intruder, but one who was welcome, if only by the way the house and she seemed to converse without words. Curiosity made me take a small step closer, my movement gentle so as not to startle her. I noticed tiny things, the faint crease of her brow as she studied the garden, the subtle tension in her jaw as if recalling a memory she wasn't quite ready to release. Even the rhythm of her breathing seemed deliberate, steadying herself against a tide of emotion that I could sense but not yet name. I felt my own heartbeat shift, not from attraction alone, but from the sheer weight of witnessing someone so attuned to a place, to a moment, that the ordinary world seemed irrelevant. Then, almost imperceptibly, she turned her head. Our eyes met for just a heartbeat. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the stranger who had approached, only a pause, a recognition, as if she had measured me in that instant and decided I could stay, or perhaps that she could allow herself to be seen. I noticed the faintest curve of her lips, a quiet smile that didn't reach her eyes fully but hinted at humor, or maybe a flicker of relief. That small gesture pulled me in further, stirred something I hadn't expected, a longing to understand her, not just the house, not just the story she carried, but her. She shifted her weight slightly, brushing a hand against the fabric of her coat in a way that was almost absent-minded. I noticed the soft sound of it, a muted whisper, like the faint rustle of a page turning. She was fully present, but in a world of her own creation. The house, the memories, the sunlight, the quiet street, all of it blended into a private tableau, and I was allowed to watch, to witness without intruding. And yet, despite the distance, there was a subtle thread of connection. I felt it in the way our glances lingered, in the almost imperceptible acknowledgement of shared space. She didn't speak, but I sensed an invitation in her stillness, a quiet trust that made the air between us charged with something neither of us had named. In that moment, I realized the story wasn't about the house at all. It was about her. The way she occupied the space, the way she held memories in her posture, her gaze, the gentle tilt of her head. I didn't know her name, didn't know why she was here, but I already felt that whatever unfolded next would matter, and not just to her, but to me, in ways I couldn't yet understand. She finally spoke, though it wasn't a greeting or a question, it was a murmur, soft and deliberate, carried as if the wind itself had chosen to deliver it. "Everything I have is here," she said, her voice barely rising above the quiet hum of the neighborhood. It wasn't the words themselves that struck me, but the weight behind them. I noticed the small tremor in her hands as they rested lightly on the porch railing, the way her shoulders seemed to sag just a fraction as if she had been holding something heavy for far too long. The words hung in the air, not as a statement about a house, but about life, memory, and the invisible threads that tie a person to a place they call home. I stepped slightly closer, careful to give her space, yet unable to resist the pull of curiosity. The sunlight had shifted, painting her profile in golden warmth, highlighting the faint lines around her eyes, the soft curve of her jaw, and the delicate grace of someone who had lived fully, loved cautiously, and carried more than her share of quiet sorrows. There was strength there, yes, but also vulnerability, a quiet honesty that seemed almost tactile, like reaching out and brushing against a piece of fine silk. Her eyes flicked toward me, briefly, then returned to the house, lingering on a window that reflected the late afternoon light. It was as if she were sharing the memory of someone she had once been, or someone she had loved, without saying a word. I felt my chest tighten in response, not from romantic desire yet, but from the sheer intimacy of being allowed to witness a private, sacred moment. I wanted to ask her what she meant, to hear the story behind the words, but something in the way she held herself stopped me. There was no hurry in her movements, no need for explanation. It was enough to be here, to stand beside the house with her presence filling the air with unspoken history. And yet, despite her reserve, there was a thread of invitation in her stillness, a subtle acknowledgement that I was no longer just a passerby, I was a witness to her world, however briefly. The breeze shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of late autumn leaves, a mix of earthiness and the faint perfume she wore, subtle, warm, and grounding. Her voice, though quiet, lingered in my ears, wrapping around my thoughts like a soft melody I couldn't forget. I felt a strange mix of respect and fascination, a desire to step closer yet knowing that some moments required patience, that some bonds began with silence rather than speech. In that instant, I understood that her attachment was not to the walls, the garden, or even the memories themselves, but to the essence of a life lived here. And in the way she murmured her words, I sensed the invisible scaffolding of emotion she had built around herself, strength wrapped in tenderness, courage tempered by caution, and a vulnerability she shared with no one, until now, perhaps, with me. I took a slow, careful breath and allowed myself to simply be present. No questions, no explanations, just presence. Her words, her posture, the subtle play of light across her face, and the quiet gravity of the moment held me captive. And I realized, for the first time, that this wasn't just a fleeting encounter. Something had shifted, an unspoken connection had been established, fragile yet unmistakable, waiting for the next move, the next word, the next breath shared in that quiet space. She moved toward the house, and I followed, not out of necessity but because an invisible thread seemed to pull me forward. The air between us was quiet, yet charged, not with words, but with presence. Every step she took seemed measured, deliberate, as if she were walking through memories, not merely rooms. The soft thud of her shoes against the wooden floor echoed faintly, a rhythm that felt intimate, private, like a heartbeat only I was allowed to hear. Inside, the house smelled faintly of aged wood, lingering perfume, and the subtle hint of lemon polish, ordinary scents that suddenly felt sacred, tied to the life she had lived here. She paused near the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the railing, fingers tracing the grain as though reading its story. I noticed the slight tremor in her touch, the way she inhaled softly, like each breath was a tether to the past she wasn't ready to let go of. I found myself studying her, not as an observer of beauty alone, but as someone aware of every small gesture, every micro-expression. The tilt of her head as she glanced at a framed photograph, the faint crease at the corner of her mouth that suggested a memory too poignant to speak aloud. And when our hands brushed for the first time, lightly, almost by accident, I felt the warmth radiate through me, subtle and grounding, like the quiet assurance of sunlight spilling across a chilled room. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand lingered for a heartbeat longer, and I sensed a silent acknowledgement of our shared presence. We moved from room to room, each space revealing layers of her life, a worn armchair with a cozy blanket folded neatly on the side, a collection of books lined perfectly on the shelf, a teacup still resting on the kitchen counter. I realized that these were more than objects, they were pieces of her story, markers of everyday rituals and moments of solitude, woven together in the tapestry of her home. As she showed me around, she spoke occasionally, softly, almost as if to herself. A comment about the sunlight on the floorboards, a remark about how the garden had thrived this year. Her voice was melodic, not loud or commanding, but deliberate, carrying an understated warmth that invited attention. And I listened, not to reply, but to understand, to inhabit this quiet space with her, to witness the life she cherished. At one point, she leaned slightly to adjust a framed photo, and our hands met again. This time, our fingers intertwined briefly, naturally, almost instinctively. The touch was brief, yet it resonated more deeply than words ever could. I felt her heartbeat, steady, calm, yet pulsing with something unspoken. And in that simple, gentle contact, the tension between curiosity and intimacy grew, slow and deliberate, like a tide inching forward with inexorable force. For the first time, I realized that the house itself was secondary. What mattered, the gravity that drew me here, the quiet magnetism I couldn't resist, was her. Her presence, the way she held herself, the life she had built, and the subtle invitation she offered without uttering a single directive. Every glance, every brush of her hand, every soft inhalation told me more than 1,000 words could. This was a life full of meaning, and somehow, without explanation, I was becoming part of its periphery. And in that realization, the slow-burn connection between us deepened. It wasn't romantic yet, not in a conventional sense, but it was intimate in the way two souls could occupy the same space and feel the quiet gravity of shared understanding, curiosity, and perhaps the first hints of longing. We settled in the living room, a quiet hush surrounding us, broken only by the soft creak of floorboards and the occasional rustle of leaves from the garden outside. The sunlight slanted through the windows, catching the dust motes in its warm glow, making the air feel almost tangible. She sank into the worn armchair, and I found myself sitting across from her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, yet close enough to feel the unspoken connection pulsing between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, almost hesitantly, she began to share the story of why selling the house was so hard. Her voice was low, fragile yet steady, carrying the weight of memories she had held close for years. She spoke of laughter that had once echoed through the rooms, of quiet evenings spent in the garden, of milestones celebrated within these walls. Each word revealed layers of attachment, vulnerability, and the silent ache of letting go. I listened, saying nothing, but my presence became my language. Every now and then, my gaze lingered on her hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair, noticing how her fingers twitched slightly when she mentioned a particularly poignant memory. I felt a protective impulse stir within me, not possessive, but tender, a desire to offer comfort without intruding, to be a steady presence in a moment that was entirely hers. At one point, she paused, her eyes glistening ever so slightly, and I leaned forward without thinking, letting my shoulder brush gently against hers. It was a small, tentative gesture, almost accidental, yet it conveyed everything words could not. She didn't recoil. Instead, her shoulder softened, pressing just slightly against mine, and for a heartbeat, I felt the quiet steadiness of her being settled against mine. It was intimate, yet innocent, a gesture that spoke of trust, of shared humanity, and of unspoken understanding. She looked up at me then, eyes meeting mine, searching perhaps for reassurance, for acknowledgement that it was okay to feel, to grieve, to hesitate. And in that gaze, I saw a flicker of gratitude, of connection, of recognition that someone was here with her, not to rush her, not to intrude, but simply to be. The air between us seemed to thicken, filled with emotion too complex to name, yet unmistakable in its resonance. I realized that intimacy didn't always need words. It existed in the brush of a hand, the soft inhale of breath, the shared stillness in a room heavy with memories. In that moment, I understood that our bond was forming quietly, a slow burn igniting through presence rather than conversation, through subtle gestures rather than declarations. And then she sighed, a long, soft exhale, as if releasing a small fragment of the weight she had carried alone for so long. I felt my own chest loosen, a sense of closeness blooming in the shared silence, a warmth that wasn't romantic yet, but profoundly human. It was a tenderness that lingered, a quiet moment of emotional resonance that promised something more, something deeper, waiting to unfold in the rooms we now shared together. By the time we shifted, moving toward the window to watch the sunlight fade, I knew one thing clearly: whatever came next, the trust and vulnerability she had offered me would guide the slow, deliberate unfolding of our connection. The light outside had softened into the gentle amber of late afternoon, painting the room with a warmth that felt intimate, almost protective. We moved toward the large window overlooking the garden, not speaking, but existing in a shared rhythm that needed no words. She leaned slightly against the windowsill, and I took a place nearby, careful to respect her space yet drawn to the quiet gravity of her presence. For a long while, we simply watched the way the sunlight caught the leaves, the way shadows stretched and twisted across the garden. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. In the silence, there was a peculiar comfort, an acknowledgement that sometimes, connection doesn't require conversation. It exists in the shared breathing of two people who recognize each other's vulnerabilities and are content to be present. Then, almost imperceptibly, I reached out to brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek. My fingers lingered near her skin, not in urgency but in careful attentiveness, feeling the warmth that radiated gently from her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head just slightly, exposing the line of her jaw and the curve of her neck to the soft touch. That simple act spoke volumes, a quiet understanding between two people, a recognition that it was safe to let another witness one's unguarded moments. Her hand brushed against mine almost by accident, a touch so fleeting it could have been overlooked, yet I felt it fully. The pulse of her heartbeat, subtle yet present beneath her skin, resonated against mine. A quiet warmth spread through me, not of desire, but of recognition, an acknowledgement that we were sharing something profound, something far deeper than casual interaction or fleeting curiosity. I caught her gaze then, and it lingered longer than before. There was a softness in her eyes now, an openness tempered by experience, and I felt a protective, almost reverential instinct take hold. The years she carried in her posture, in the slight quiver of her fingers, in the cadence of her breath, all of it made me want to stay close, to offer silent reassurance, to let her know she wasn't alone in the quiet of her memories. We shared a small laugh at a memory she recalled of the house's past, nothing monumental, just a fleeting moment of lightness amid the weight of nostalgia. Her smile was subtle, unpolished, yet it illuminated the room more than the sunlight ever could. I realized then that intimacy didn't need declarations or dramatic gestures. It existed in these tiny, human moments, in the brush of hands, the quiet laughter, the shared stillness that spoke of trust and emotional resonance. As the day waned and shadows deepened, I sensed a shift in the room, a settling, a mutual understanding that the connection we were forming could grow slowly, safely, and meaningfully. The tension that had quietly hummed between us had softened into warmth, an unspoken promise that whatever path lay ahead, it would be guided by patience, empathy, and shared presence. In that quiet, amber-lit room, I realized that the house was no longer just hers to occupy. It had become a shared space, a canvas for connection, a place where vulnerability could be met with respect and tenderness. And in that understanding, a new rhythm began, a slow, deliberate heartbeat between two people learning to inhabit the same emotional space with care and quiet affection. The sun had begun its descent, casting a soft, golden haze over the garden outside, and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting with us. After hours of quiet presence, small touches, and shared glances, the weight of memories and unspoken words had settled into something gentle, something that felt both familiar and new. She moved slowly toward the door that led to the backyard, and I followed at a respectful distance, each step measured, careful not to disrupt the rhythm we had created. We walked among the late blooms and fallen leaves, the air cool but softened by the lingering warmth of sunlight. I noticed how she paused to brush her fingers along a flower stem, then let her hand linger near mine, close enough that the warmth radiated between us. It wasn't deliberate, yet it was deliberate, a silent invitation, an acknowledgement of connection without a single word spoken. Her gaze swept across the garden, across the familiar corners of the house she had held in her heart, and finally rested on me. For the first time, the tension of hesitancy seemed to ease, replaced with a quiet certainty. She offered a small smile, one that carried relief, gratitude, and a subtle acknowledgement that she wasn't alone in navigating this space of endings and beginnings. I returned the smile, letting the quiet understanding settle between us like a gentle embrace. I reached out slowly, taking her hand in mine, our fingers intertwining naturally, as though they had known each other for far longer than hours. The warmth of her skin, the softness of her touch, and the faint pulse of her heartbeat beneath my fingertips spoke more than words ever could. It was a touch filled with respect, tenderness, and a shared recognition of vulnerability. In that moment, it felt as though time had slowed, allowing us to exist fully in the fragile, beautiful space between past and future. We walked together through the garden, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot accompanying our quiet conversation about the memories the house held and the possibilities that lay ahead. She spoke of letting go, of preserving the essence of what mattered most, and I listened, offering only the steady presence of someone who understood, who honored the significance of each memory without rushing her. By the time we returned inside, the sunlight had faded into a warm, dim glow, and the house seemed quieter, gentler. She paused in the living room, turning toward me with a gaze that held trust and a hint of something more, a promise that the connection we had formed was real and enduring. Our hands brushed again, this time lingering slightly longer, fingers resting comfortably against one another, a silent affirmation of mutual understanding, care, and affection. In that moment, it became clear that the house was no longer just hers, it was ours to share, in memory, in presence, in the quiet intimacy of two lives meeting without fanfare, without rush. The tension that had existed at the beginning, the hesitancy, the quiet longing, had transformed into warmth, comfort, and connection. As she murmured softly about the house and the life she had cherished within it, I felt an undeniable sense of closure and completeness. The story had reached its natural conclusion, not with dramatic declarations, not with sweeping gestures, but with the gentle affirmation of presence, trust, and mutual respect. And in that quiet, amber-lit room, I realized that sometimes, love isn't a rush or a fever, it is the steady warmth of being seen, understood, and held, even in silence.